This is the Forbes Books podcast, conversations with remarkable folks impacting the world of business and beyond. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and today we're talking about banking for good. And no, this is not a Black Mirror episode of the podcast. My guest is Peter Scher, the Vice Chairman of JPMorgan Chase. 15 years ago, Peter brought a blend of public and private sector leadership to take on the monumental task of reshaping the firm's approach to corporate responsibility and community investment. Under his watch, JPMorgan Chase pioneered a new philanthropy model focused on partnering with local organizations to create systemic, sustainable progress. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Yo, thanks. It is great to be with you.
Oh, well, thank you very much for taking the time. So, I interview all sorts of entrepreneurs on this podcast and some in the medical field. So doctors/entrepreneurs, and they always tell me that the last thing they want to tell anyone at any social gathering is that they're a doctor, because the next thing they know, they will probably doing some sort of medical examination in the bathroom or something like that. So when you tell folks that you work for JPMorgan Chase, does the floodgates of questions open up about banking and everything like that?
Usually not. I've had the experience in my career of being the lawyer you didn't really want to call if you're in legal trouble, and being the banker you don't really call if you want to, you need a loan or a checking account. But the reality is, and I hope this doesn't sound too sappy, you look at the work I get to do every day in communities around the world and leverage this bank to try to make a difference right now. So I very proudly wear the uniform of JPMorgan Chase wherever I go.
And you hinted there about your legal hat of being a lawyer. You transitioned from working in law strictly to banking in 2008. If memory serves, was not a great time to be in banking. So, Peter, do you have a screw loose or something?
Yes.
What's going on in that head of you've had this successful law career? You know what? Worst financial crisis in the history of this country. I want to get into banking.
My wife likes to remind people that everything seemed okay in the banking sector before I got there. So,
okay.
You know what? I had spent a good part of my career in government, in public service, and then I was practicing law. And this opportunity came up. Mutual friend wanted to introduce me to Jamie Dimon. And I said, well, I always like meeting interesting people. I wasn't looking to move, but I went to New York and spent an hour with Jamie. This was in 2007 when he had just been CEO for maybe a year and a half at this point. And he talked about the need for companies, banks, other companies, to play a more active role in public policy and addressing issues in the community. And frankly, I'd never heard a CEO talk like this. And so it was just a very compelling thing. And it was an opportunity to, be a part of a firm and a leadership group that thinks about the world and thinks about our role in the world. So it was, the timing was not great. But listen, the reality is, if you look at sort of that period of time, 2008 through 2011, JPMorgan played an enormous leadership role in helping navigate the country and a good part of the world through this financial crisis. And so I was proud to be a part of it.
And it's funny, you mentioned 2007 and how Jamie Dimon was sort of forward thinking in the fact of business for good, because you said that after 2020, you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. In 2007, that's like sci-fi talk, Peter. So when you were hearing Jamie talk about this, we're like, what's up with this guy?
Well, I thought, here's a very serious guy. He had a very serious career in banking and brought Bank One back from, kind of the precipice. And then before JPMorgan Chase and Bank One merged back in end of 2005. And, he's a serious guy. And the fact that he was so ahead of his time in recognizing that for business, this isn't like, we should be good. We should do good because it's the moral thing, it's the right thing, but that, the inequities in society and the divisions in society and all things, particularly so post-financial crisis, at the end of the day are bad for business. And so to work for a guy who recognized that we have the ability to use the levers and the tools and the resources of this firm to kind of bridge some of those divides and help build up communities, because at the end of the day, it's good for our shareholders, good for business. Well, I walked down to that first meeting in 2007 and called my wife, who thought I was just going to have a meeting with Jamie Dimon, and said, I got to go work for this guy. I can't miss this opportunity.
Wow. That's so cool. And before we get into what you're doing now, I'm just curious, how different is your job now as opposed to 2008? Because I feel like, as I joked, that was very forward thinking at the time. People weren't doing that regularly. When you were going to the street, going out to people, trying to lay out your plan to folks outside JPMorgan Chase, were the reactions different then than they are now? I just want to get a feel of how different it used to be back then.
Yeah, so two things. So when I came into the firm in 2008, my job was to run government relations. So I was dealing, and frankly, most of JPMorgan Chase from 2008 through 2011 was literally about government relations because, the government had to step in because of the financial crisis, had to take, significant action to deal with some of the banks that failed, to deal with banks to prop them up. So I spent most of my time for the first 3 years in that sort of government regulatory phase. It was in 2011, after the financial crisis, that Jamie asked me to take on this broader role of corporate responsibility, which included philanthropy and sustainability and a range of issues. And he was the one, I had no background in this, by the way. So I had been government, policy, lawyer. This is my first job ever in a company. Never done anything around philanthropy. And he said, I want you to sort of take a step back and look at what we're doing. And are we doing this as effectively as we can? And I think, this is a great sign of leadership to me, because in most places, I think the problem, particularly in big companies, is we do things because that's how we've been doing them for, 10 years or 50 years. And to say, let's take a step back and really understand. So really in 2011, 2012, we really looked at how we engaged in communities. And the reality, like a lot of companies, we wrote a bunch of checks, issued some press releases, and didn't really worry about, was that actually, driving change? And the mandate that I got was like, we have this huge array of resources in the firm, not just the money, but the expertise and the data and the relationships around the world. How do you actually leverage those in a way that's going to make a difference? And, a long answer to your question, there were people hugely skeptical when we first started back in 11 and 12. There were people who thought like we created the problems and now we were planning to solve them. There were people who looked at banks and said, these guys just want to make money and like this is all PR. And so we had to, the way we ultimately proved them wrong was to be serious about the work and hire serious people and show up in a serious way and try to, have some humility as you particularly go into communities that have been struggling for years, and recognize that like there were a lot of reasons that communities failed. And it wasn't all because of banks, but it was in part because of banks. It was in part terrible government policy. I mean, there were a whole range of reasons that we've had these divisions. And to say, look, we want to show up and be part of the solution. We want to listen and hear and understand where we can be helpful. There was huge skepticism about whether or not we were serious. And so the way to overcome that is to actually be serious. And so we approached it in a very serious, thoughtful way, not about the next press release or PR, but about actually how can you solve problems.
Love it. And so let's peel that onion a little bit in terms of what you're doing now, what your job has become. And the phrase that you mentioned was investing in communities. Now, me as someone who, not that bright, Peter, as you can tell, what does it mean when a bank invests in communities?
Right. And if I can, let me use Detroit as an example. So that's been, that has been a defining investment for our firm. And this goes back. So, 2011 and 12, we were kind of rethinking how we would approach these issues, focusing on what we were good at, right? And understanding where we had expertise, and there are areas, when you think about affordable housing, which is an issue in every community around the world. You talk about workforce skills and how do you train people for the jobs being created? Huge issues in communities around the world. How do you help small businesses grow? I mean, there were a few areas. And so part of the initial decision was, instead of trying to do 100 things kind of mediocre, let's do 3 or 4 things really well. And so we identified those 3 or 4 things. And then in 2013, Jamie asked me to go out to Detroit and see if there was anything we could do to help. And the story in Detroit at the time was not a great story. July 2013, Detroit enters the bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in the history of the United States. quarter of the population was unemployed. There were probably 110, 120,000 vacant or abandoned homes. Half the street lights were out. Ambulances weren't showing up. It was a big challenge. But when we showed up, what we actually saw was the community had decided they were going to come together and try to actually take back their future. And we said, we looked at the range of areas that the local organizations, the government, or the business were making investments in, and said, how can we help? Right? Here we are from Wall Street. We want to tell you how to fix your problems, but how can we help catalyze and scale some of the change? And so that's what we did. I mean, we spent 6 months really on the ground, dozens of people from JPMorgan, business people, risk people, finance people, understanding what were the city's plans to bring itself back, to revitalize, and where could we be catalytic? Where could we be helpful? And we identified 3 or 4 key areas, and we made a decision to invest $100 million at a time that not a lot of companies were investing in Detroit. We were just there a few weeks ago for the 10-year anniversary. Unemployment is now down to its lowest level in 20 years. It was 25%. It's now less than 7%. Per capita income for Detroit residents has increased by 23%. The number of people who have been trained for jobs, the investment going in, housing prices are up. And you know what the most important thing I would tell you for us? Our business is doing better. Our business is up. Loans are up. Deposits are up. So it is a demonstration that when you actually invest in communities, it is good for business. When you lift communities, we can't outgrow a community. So if Detroit is in a negative economic situation, that's going to impact us. If Detroit's growing at 3, 4, 5%, that's good for banks. It's good for business. Like this becomes a win-win, and this is kind of what we learned, that investing in communities is actually a great payback for our shareholders. I mean, I was just in Baltimore on Friday. West Baltimore, seen some of the worst race riots back 6-7 years ago. We're now hiring call center workers in this area, and because we're seeing talent. So where you can look, companies need talent right now. We need workforce is one of the biggest issues we face. And what we're seeing is if you could unlock opportunity, if you can create opportunity for people who have not normally been given it, you create a lot of talent for the firm.
And this is not like some sort of philanthropic, write a check for $100 million and take some pictures with a big check in front of something with a ribbon. You mentioned that there were 3 or 4 things that you identified. Can you talk about one of those investments that you made where it was beyond just offering the money? What else came out of that?
100%. Well, I'll give you a couple. So small business, when we first went into Detroit, I underestimated how important small business would be to the growth. And we made a couple of small investments in incubators and things like that, but it wasn't really hitting it. And, part of our philosophy is let's keep a close eye and we're going to try things. And if things don't work, then let's stop doing those things that don't work and figure out things that do work. And I was having conversations with the mayor, and he was talking about the challenge was a lot of Black and brown entrepreneurs couldn't get access to capital. And because of regulatory reasons, we couldn't lend through traditional banking channels. And we said, okay, let's not take no for an answer here. Let's figure out how do we create a model. We created something in Detroit called the Entrepreneurs of Color Fund. Started out as a $4 or $5 million fund. First year and a half, we did 75 loans. We had 2 defaults in 75 loans. It's a pretty good track record.
Yeah.
That's a $25 million fund in Detroit, and it's now in 12 other states. It's now a national program. So we are actually now, we have small business expertise. This is not like, okay, here's a check, go figure it out. This is how do we create a funding model for entrepreneurs? I'll give you another example. Early on, the workforce system in Detroit was completely broken. As I mentioned, a quarter of the population wasn't working, and there were just not enough jobs. We worked closely with the mayor and local leaders to build up essentially a workforce agency called Detroit at Work, which now sources talent. So when we made a decision to hire call center employees in Detroit back about a year ago, so we were going to try a new model, virtual call centers, people who can actually do call center jobs from home. Called the mayor. Within 48 hours, Detroit at Work had identified 50 qualified applicants. We hired all 50. We were going to hire 30. We're now at almost 100.
Wow.
Right? And by the way, these employees, they're performing as well or better than in our traditional brick and mortar call centers. Okay. We've just expanded as a measure. We just announced it in Baltimore with Governor Wes Moore and Mayor Brandon Scott. So we're using, where we use philanthropic dollars, we use it to catalyze business investment. At the end of the day, if you what's going to make a difference in these communities is if you create a sustainable community of investment where companies see there's an opportunity to actually invest, hire workers, build their business, expand, and if I can say, make money, right? And that's the alignment you have with the goals of a community.
And how do you identify successes? Obviously, you rattle off a couple there that have to do with dollars, but is it strictly dollars? Is that your barometer for what's a success in a city?
No, we measure. So if we invest in a workforce program, we approach these investments like we approach business investments. How many people got trained? Of the people who got trained, how many people got hired? Of the people who got hired, how many people actually stayed in the jobs, for a year or more? Of those people who stayed in jobs, how many of them progressed to new jobs? We have metrics that we look at on each of our investments because, again, if they're not working, I don't want to keep spending money on things that aren't working. I'll find new things to spend money on. So we look at, how many jobs are created, how many small businesses are being created, and small business is a very difficult, challenging environment. How many of them can sustain? If we're investing in affordable housing, I want to know how many houses are being created, who's moving into that. So we are looking at the economic activity to know that we're making sound investment.
And we're seeing now, since the last 3 years, mass migration from these bigger cities that we've talked about, the Baltimores and the Detroits of the world, moving to other areas that were probably, they didn't have the sort of infrastructure in place. They don't have all the, have the cash flow that these other big cities have. What's JPMorgan's, tact when it comes to these new burgeoning cities that don't have the hundreds of years of histories that a Detroit or Baltimore have? Are you getting involved at that level as well?
Yeah, our criteria, listen, we're a big company. We operate all over the country. We now have branches in every one of the 48 lower states. What we look at when we want to make an investment is, listen, we look at a lot of data, we look at numbers, we look at the population, we look at the demographics. But at the end of the day, we want to know, do you have the right leadership? Do you have the right political leadership? Do you have the right business leadership? Do you have an environment that people want you to invest? We'll be in Paris in a couple of weeks. We've made substantial expansions and investments in the Paris area. Part of it was post-Brexit when, the rules changed and we had to move a certain number of employees out of the UK and into sort of continental Europe. But at the time, this is 5 years ago, again, the question was, okay, we're going to expand our model and we're going to expand our business and increase hiring in Paris. What are the economic challenges that we're seeing? And we identified an area in sort of what they call Greater Paris called Seine-Saint-Denis, which high levels of unemployment, high levels of poverty. And we asked ourselves the question, is there anything we can do to help address this? And, again, if you think there were skeptics in Detroit, I can tell you, I can give you a long list of the skeptics in Paris and thought, okay, here's some U.S. company. But we actually, one of the things when we make these investments, we send teams of our people, our bankers, finance experts, risk experts, HR experts in. And we did that early on in Paris, back in kind of early 2018, to see, do we have the right partners on the ground? Is there the right leadership? I went and met with Mayor Hidalgo, who's the mayor of Paris, and I was told in advance, listen, she doesn't like banks and she doesn't speak English. And I spent 2 hours with her, and she didn't care that I was, like, people hate what I say this, but I'm saying it anyway. She didn't care that I was a capitalist. I didn't care that she was a socialist. We were talking about how can you actually lift this community. And we've made investments, and we have now, we're announcing an increase of those investments in Paris, and jobs are being created, small business. The challenge that you see in U.S. cities are not are not unique for what you see around the world. That's sort of the with all the challenges of humanity right now, there's a common thread that people want opportunity. And so if there are investments that we can make that create jobs, that help small businesses grow, that create housing, and we feel like we've got the right partners in place to do it, and we can catalyze further business investment, then that's kind of what we do.
So it sounds like your approach is a one size fits all, even though people don't like that sort of nomenclature. But you guys come in with the big ideas and you can do it anywhere, essentially?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I don't think we come in with big ideas at all. Because the fact is, I can't go into Detroit with New York ideas, and I can't go into Baltimore with Detroit ideas. Every community is unique. There's a common thread where we can be helpful. And so where we go into a community, we know small business growth, workforce skills, economic development, housing. These are challenges, but the approach in each community is different. And so what we do is go in is understand how is the community coming together to try to address these challenges, and how can we be helpful in supporting those approaches, investment, expertise, how do we scale those? So it's definitely not a one size fits all, because every community is unique. We have to sort of know what we're good at. We're not going to be the people who come in and fix pre-K education, right? As important as that is, there's a whole range of challenges in these communities that we're not going to fix. We know what we're good at, and where we have the right combination of leaders and partners on the ground, and they want us there, that's where we can come in and make investments and be helpful. So it's not at all a one size fits all.
You mentioned this one word a couple times, and that's skeptics. You mentioned when you started the job at JPMorgan Chase. You mentioned it here in Paris. Is that part of your job as well, trying to sort of quash the skeptics of hey, we're doing good here, and it's not some sort of, we're not here for nefarious reasons, because not again, not that you're making it seem like this is what you do, but is that part of the sort of struggle at the beginning of these projects?
Yeah, it's a bit of a struggle, but it's also, look, we don't have to do this. I mean, there's no law that says we have to go into these places. So we do a lot of homework to make sure that the community writ large wants us. Now, writ large, listen, there's always going to be a certain number of people who don't trust banks, don't think we belong. That's fine. At one point in Detroit, we had, I think there was 20% of the people were negative about this. Mine is if 80% of the people support what we're doing, I'll take that. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time. There are people who just are never going to like banks. And that's, that's their God-given right to not like banks. But there are people who are doing serious work in these communities. Look, we were in Baltimore on Friday with Democratic governor, Democratic lieutenant governor, half his cabinet, the Democratic mayor, half the city council, a lot of community groups who said, listen, if you can work with us to grow jobs and create opportunity, come on in. We want you. And listen, there are other places that say, you know what, I don't care if you can do that, you're a bank, we don't want you. That's fine. We're not going to push our way into a place that doesn't feel like we can be a constructive part of the conversation. And listen, what the onus is on us is, if we want to be a constructive part of the conversation, we have to be serious. We have to listen. We can't be like the arrogant bankers showing up. And so that's what we try to do. And if you talk to people in these communities, I think they will tell you that our approach has made a difference.
You casually name dropped one of the most powerful humans on the planet, Jamie Dimon, earlier, and I'm curious.
Well, it's not casual. He's my boss, so.
Yeah. Well, no, I know. I met with Jamie Dimon. I told my wife I was going to be with Jamie Dimon. Sure. Very, very cool about you there, Peter. But what makes him so special? Why has he withstood the turbulent times, the highs, the lows? He's been the constant there. For the outsider who again may be skeptical of, oh boy, here come the bankers. Why is he so special?
Listen, he grew up in the banking sector, so he's always been in financial services. He understands how every business operates. He's just a sponge for information, and that's all I think important. But I think the two other, his leadership qualities are really important. He wants people around him who are going to tell him the truth, who are going to disagree with him, who are going to engage in debate. And that's what we do. He's very non-hierarchical, which is funny. You think about companies, particularly companies as large as ours. If the person who is like 6 levels down has the answer, that's who he wants to talk to. He's not going to waste his time going through 7 layers to get to the answer. He's a very efficient guy. But I think from my perspective, the most important quality is he thinks about the world and he thinks about our role in the world. I mean, I remember one of my earliest experiences during the financial crisis. We were in a crisis mode and our bankers were trying to do a bond deal for the state of Illinois. And they literally couldn't sell. No one would buy bonds for the state of Illinois. And that was going to essentially, if they couldn't sell bonds, the state was going to go into bankruptcy. And there was a big debate. Should we buy a few? Should we buy 10%? Should we buy 15%? And I remember sitting in this meeting. This was very early on in my tenure. And Jamie said, buy them all. $1 billion in bonds for the state of Illinois. He said, buy them all. He said, our job right now is to show confidence in the system. Okay? That takes a lot of guts and it takes a lot of fortitude. But that's what, I've seen it all the time. I don't think when I came back from Detroit after 6 months and said, I think we could spend $100 million, invest $100 million. Wisely, I think there were a lot of, you know about external skeptics, you think about the internal skeptics, and he said, listen, we have to try. I mean, I'm involved in this healthcare work that we've been involved in, which he's tried in different iterations, but he really thinks about how an institution like JPMorgan Chase, with its resources and its expertise and its reach, can impact the world. And that's why at the end of the day, that's good for us as a bank. It's good for our shareholders. And I think you look at our economics, you look at our share price, and the fact is it continues to grow. And like Jamie's not shy about his views about the world. So it's working. And hopefully it's a signal to other companies that there's not a choice between being a good corporate citizen and being a good business, that these things are interconnected and that they actually make us a stronger company. And the individuals in business want to bank with a company who actually gives a damn about the state of the community and the state of the world. And so I think that's the kind of proposition that we've been proving over the last 15 years.
All right. Well, I don't know a lot of billionaires in my life. So what would surprise someone if they met Jamie Dimon? Like, what is the one thing, like maybe something random, like he drinks, Arnold Palmer's during the, I don't know.
He is one of the most, I'll tell you, one of the things, and this is sort of a personal thing, is how kind he is to my kids. He cares deeply about the families of the people who work with him and for him. He's a very down-to-earth guy. He's not a guy you're going to see on the social circuit in New York. He's got 7 grandchildren now, and he FaceTimes with the grandkids. He talks more about the grandkids. I think he would say himself, he has 2 purposes in life. One of them is leading his company, and the other is being a husband and a dad and a granddad. He embraces that all. He also has for a guy, he has a sense of humility about him, and he's willing to listen to other people's views of the world. So he's a pretty unique guy. I mean, he's one of the greatest bosses I've ever had.
And let's tie that in with you. What does it mean to have that sort of leadership above you? Because, it's obviously a trickle-down effect because, it starts with him, trickles down to you, and then the folks that work with you trickles down to them. So how important is that bridge of a strong leader at the top to you there and then everyone on the way down to helping these cities like Detroit and Baltimore? Well, what does that all mean?
I think it creates, I do, whoever said culture beats strategy for lunch, I think it creates a culture that people care deeply about what we're doing. They have a lot of pride in what we're doing. And they're also willing to take chances. He knows we're going to try things that aren't going to work. And the sin here is not trying things that don't work. The sin is like not recognizing they didn't work and trying something else. So I think you create a culture in which people feel like they can stretch themselves. I mean, one of the things I think that's so interesting about this company, it's not siloed. I've seen people who come in to work for me doing philanthropy or government relations. They become bankers. There's like this attitude in this firm that, if you work hard and you get along with people It's not how smart you are. I think people would be surprised. There's much more of an emphasis on EQ than IQ in this place, because there are a lot of really smart people in the world, but they're, at the end of the day, are there people you actually want to work with?
Wow. And so wrapping this up, your circuitous career, government, law, now working with a bank. There's no way you could have predicted this when you were a kid. When you were a kid, like, what did you want to do when you grew up?
If someone had told me when I was 20 or 30 or 40 that I'd be working in a bank, you might as well have told me I'd be sitting on the moon, like, eating cheese. Like, there was nothing in my background or history that would have predicted it. But it's always, there's very natural evolution. I worked in politics, I worked in government, I practiced law. And you think about business right now, we're at the intersection of all of that. And I think for me, I don't know that I could do this in other companies. I think there are companies that are starting to get really good at this, and that's great. But, to have this sort of combination of a company that has these kind of resources and willing to spend. I always believed, I grew up in a very politically active family, right? When I was 7 years old, one of my earliest memories I grew up on Long Island in New York, and we all drove in my parents' station wagon to a Hubert Humphrey rally when he was running for president. And I always believed that public service really meant government service. But the idea that for me now, I can see that you can serve the public and you can build communities and you can make a difference in people's lives through the lens of a business. I don't think, like you said, I don't think in 2007 or 8 people would have thought that. I certainly didn't think that growing up or serving government. And it's been one of the most unique and incredible experiences I've ever had.
So cool. And the word unicorn gets thrown around in the VC and investment world. In a way, you're sort of a unicorn, right? Are you like a banking unicorn? How many Peter Schers are out there doing what you're doing?
I don't know. Listen, I think what's really interesting is when I came into this firm, as you said, during the financial crisis, I didn't know anything about banking. And I said, listen, when I was interviewing and I talked to Jamie and the leaders of the firm, and they were like, listen, we got lots of people who know. That's our problem is not like, do we have people who know about banking? We got thousands and thousands and thousands of people. I actually think it's a great leadership lesson, like, for anyone, in terms of, like, whether it's the biggest company or the smallest company, having a team of people with diverse backgrounds and experiences, perspectives. It's all about how you actually bring that together. So I think that, I think there are a lot of people. There was a woman who worked for me for years, who was one of the most liberal people, campaigned for candidates that I would never. And I said, like, what do you say to your friends when you tell them that you're working? What do your friends say when you tell them that you work at JPMorgan Chase? And she said, listen, I want to make a difference. I have a chance to do here what I can't do anyplace else. And listen, it may not be for everyone, but for me, it's been a chance to actually have the kind of impact and make a difference that I sort of grew up to believe we should be doing.
It's funny, and you obviously have a sense of humor, but the fact that your career has been lawyer, banker, the irony can't be lost on the fact that those are jobs that are that get a lot of crap these days.
100%. Listen, I worked on the Hill. I became staff director of the Senate Environment Committee with, like, no background in the environment. But again, it's your point earlier. What I hope that I've learned over the years from a lot of different bosses are, how do you lead, and how do you understand, and how do you be self-aware and understand, look, these are the things I'm good at, and these are the things I'm not good at. Let me hire people who are good at those things. And so that's been sort of always I don't need to be an expert in housing or small business. I need to know how to put together a team of people and hopefully motivate them to work together in a way that's going to make a difference. And I think companies that recognize, I've worked for leaders in the past who, like, want to have their team be mirror images of themselves, people who think like them, right? And, like, that's not, I don't think that usually doesn't mean success, right? It's the leaders who are kind of walled off, either not engaging or just talking to their kind of small cadre of sycophants, if I can say, that's not going to be a successful company. I mean, you talk about venture capital. I think what venture capital ultimately looks at is who's the management team? What's the leadership, right? It's yes, you got to look at the numbers, you got to understand that, but are you entrusting your investments to an organization, a set of people who you have confidence are going to lead? And so that, to me, that's been one of those interesting lessons that I've gotten to learn over my time here, and frankly, my time in government and elsewhere.
Awesome. His name is Peter Scher. He's the vice chairman at JPMorgan Chase. Peter, it's been a fun chat. Thanks for walking me through your life's journey. It's been a blast, and appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Joe, thank you. It's been great to talk to you.
And that'll do it for another episode of the Forbes Books podcast. Don't forget to hit subscribe. That way you'll get new episodes as soon as they're available. And if you have a spare moment, I would greatly appreciate it if you could leave a review, which would help other exceptional people like you discover the show. You can always connect with me on X, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Joe Pardavila or on TikTok at J Pardavila. And please don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.